when I read it.
Did you read it?
I read it.
You should have read the first one.
I read that too, but it was too late. When he said, and this really struck me, both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God and invoke his aid against the other. Which is true. And my favorite part was with malice towards none. Charity for all. I knew the war was ending, and I will say this. I knew if I really would want him to be president instead of the man that he chose, I don't know whether he chose, but his new vice president was not somebody I liked very well. I met him in 1846 in the Congress when I served for 6 months before I went off fighting the Mexican War. And I said, it should not be a blacksmith or a tailor to make the decision about the incoming war with Mexico. It needs to be the military. Well, there's this man from Tennessee who happened to be a tailor. And guess what? He thought I was talking directly about him as a tailor. He never liked me, and 20 years later, due to circumstances, I had to deal with it. And my wife had to deal with it. Abraham.
Yes, sir.
Go say your spiel. I've been warming up the audience for you since you were gone, and I took my cover off because they kept saying that when they wanted to get an image, they couldn't see my eyes. You know, that's how you can tell somebody that's honest by looking them in the face. But see, if you have this image and the eyes are covered, they won't be able to do that. So,
Well, you see, if you have a reputation for being honest, so much so that you're called honesty, you really don't need to worry.
Well, I'm going to go over here. Who's sitting there?
You are. Because your name is on the bottom of the seat.
I know, I put it there. I'm going to sit down for a few minutes, and I'm going to let Mr. Lincoln, he loves to talk.
The kettle full on the top left. Well, it's wonderful to be here back in Michigan. You know, I was only in Michigan one time back in the day. It was August the 27th. This very day, when I gave a speech in Kalamazoo, my only speech in Michigan. And 1856, of course, presidential election year, 1856. John Fremont, the first Republican candidate for president. James Buchanan, the Democratic candidate. I'm telling people to vote for Fremont, of course. Free man, free land, free soil, Fremont. Now, that was this very day, wasn't it? August 27th. And you know what they're doing in Kalamazoo today? Bronson Park, they're unveiling a statue. Yours too. The next time you pass through Kalamazoo, you make sure you visit Bronson Park right downtown. See my new statue. No beard, of course. Didn't have a beard then. But in that speech that I made in Kalamazoo, I remember I said a few things. Of course, 1854, a couple years before, when everything kind of broke loose, right? Stephen Douglas, Kansas, Nebraska Act. All of a sudden, looks like slavery might be able to spread to new parts of the country, into the western territories, into the north even. Might never be rid of slavery now. Eventually, the Whig Party collapsed under the pressure. This new party arose, the Republican Party, formed the first state convention of the Republican Party. Took place in what city?
Jackson.
Jackson, Michigan. July 6, 1854, under the oath, as they say. I wasn't here. I hadn't joined the Republican Party then. I was still holding on to the Whig Party, you see. But 2 years later, I'd finally given up on that. But in that speech in Kalamazoo, I remember I said this. I said, the question of slavery must not be just one of the questions. It must be very nearly the soul All these other issues we've been arguing about, the tariff and other things, got to put those aside. It's about slavery. It's about whether we allow slavery to spread into the West, into the North. That's what it's about. Remember later on in the speech, I pointed out how our free northern states, how they were so prosperous. I said, what has made us so prosperous? It is this, that every man may make himself. I said, compare our free northern states to what we got up north. Canada, ruled by a queen. Let us look to the south, where we have men who say they are free, yet keep their fellow man in bondage. Do we not have an interest in preserving our way of life, this freedom, this liberty? And later on, I even pointed out this. I said, do you realize that the state of South Carolina has 6 representatives in our Congress, the same number as the state of Maine? Even though the state of Maine has more than twice as many of voting population, the white population I'm talking about. Is that because of that 3/5 rule? You remember that? We're going to count the slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation, thus inflating the voting population in a sense in the South. I said there is no white man in the North who's worth one white man in the South because of this. Well, I'm not sure how much more I'm supposed to talk here. Just a sort of an introduction to say I'm very happy to be here, happy to be able to discuss some of these issues with Mr. Davis here. And I believe, ma'am, are you sort of coming up with some questions? I'm going to leave it up to us. All right. How do we proceed here then?
Well, I'm just going to come up and you have a question for me, Mr. Lincoln, that you would like to ask me before you sit down. And then I will answer it. And I will answer the question. I know you can. You make stuff up if you don't know. You know, like lawyers do. They win for their client.
I learned from the best.
So,
I thought a good question.
okay.
Is secession, because as you might recall,
I believe secession was legal. Why do I believe that? Because the Supreme Court never said otherwise. Now there's people that come up to me and probably Mr. Lincoln and say, doesn't it say in the Constitution that secession is illegal? No, it does not. Does it say in the Constitution that secession is illegal? Legal? No, it does not. It's never been addressed. So, Mr. Lincoln might have to shut his ears.
you're sure to listen.
I was put in prison for 2 years. Considered that I was a traitor and was implicated in the assassination attempt of someone. Now what I wanted more than anything else was a trial, but I didn't get one. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, you know, the branch of government that interprets the laws. Salmon Chase, who was his former Secretary of Treasury, said, we can't try these men. Why? They might win. A number of you people might say, this is illegal. And then all of a sudden, 20 years later, it's not. How many say, I understand exactly what you're talking about? So why did we, I'm saying we, the South, wanted to secede? Here's the problem, and Lincoln probably will address this later. These people called the abolitionists, And Mr. Lincoln would probably want to address that issue, whether he was one or not. I may say, I don't even know what an abolitionist wanted. They wanted slavery done away with immediately. William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator in 1831, that was their philosophy, get rid of it now. So, 4 million people would be released now, and the economy of the South what would happen? Some of you think, and there's people come up to me and they said, didn't all people in the South own slaves? No. Did everyone live in a big mansion? No. Very few people did. And here's another argument that might come up. Then why did these Confederate soldiers fight? Well, see, it's real easy to do this. Well, they fought to maintain. Would you spend 4 years in the mud being shot at so your rich neighbor could own a slave? If you are one of those, stand up. You know, nobody ever stands up or tells me they would. So see, I may say it's confusing, isn't it? Now, the other part of that, we have what's called fire eaters. Younger students always say, well, why did they eat fire? Mr. President? They wanted secession to happen now. We don't need the North. Was I that type of person? No, I was not. I served in the House of Representatives. I fought in the Mexican War as a lieutenant colonel for the United States Army. I fought or went to West Point Military Academy for 4 years. I was in the United States Senate twice. I was Secretary of War for 4 years under Franklin Pierce. Then why did I go with my state of Mississippi when they seceded? How many'd say if your family was threatened would stand up for them and fight? To us, the federal government might have just been the moon. Distance, rule, local governments. And then you have this strong, meddling federal government was determined to tell us how to live and how to treat our 4 million people. Did they know anything about that? You think the people in Maine understand how the people in South Carolina live? Really? Or Louisiana? There were 15 slave states in 1850. There was 15 free states in 1850. California wants to come into the Union as a free state. We allow it. What's going to happen to the representation? How many senators from each state? 2. Now it's going to be what, 30, 30? Now it's going to be 30, 32. How many believe majority should always rule? You got majority rule, you got a problem, because when you get a corrupt government that think you should think the way they do. How many's ever had discussion with somebody that can't comprehend there's another point of view besides theirs? Somebody to be able to have a discussion has to have a mind that can think that I might be wrong. I'm looking at my wife when I say that. Gentlemen, how many say I know why you're looking at her? Because how many times you think I might have said or did something that was considered. Now, I don't want to talk forever because I want this young man here. I'm going to ask him a question.
I need to answer the same question.
Was secession legal? I said at the beginning, I said the first sentence, I said I believe it was because it was never, ever ruled to be illegal. But, all I got to do this. The Supreme Court in 1869, Texas versus Black.
1869?
Yeah, well, see.
Where's he going?
Okay, 1869, the Supreme Court ruled that any state coming back or coming into the Union from then on would have to rule out the word secession. not succession. Secession. I did answer that, Mr. Lincoln. In a sense, it was never ever ruled no until the Supreme Court made a decision. Is that? Okay, so my question to you.
I need to answer my question.
Oh, okay, well you go ahead.
Because my answer is different.
Well, go ahead.
On the question of is secession legal? And now I'm fairly certain that Mr. Davis didn't read my entire first inaugural address, or maybe he's forgotten part of what I said.
I probably forgot
I
most
made
of
the
it.
case that secession was not legal. It is true, I did say, is it in the Constitution? Legal, it's not in the Constitution. But we need to look other places, don't we? For example, I said if we consider our states, well, let me start this way. Looking at our history, I said let's go back to the beginning of our nation. Now you might think 1776, Declaration of Independence, but 2 years before that, we had our first national government. Remember what it was called? The Articles of Confederation. Confederation wasn't a big dirty word back then. Articles of Confederation. You're halfway correct. The full name of that government was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And I made the argument in my first inaugural address. I said, now look, after the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, we had a Revolutionary War, then we had a new government, a constitution, a more perfect union. And I said, now, if we now have a more perfect union, and the union previously was perpetual, how could our more perfect union have lost the element of perpetuity? Perpetual, you know what that means, right?
Well, Mr. Lincoln, you better explain that.
Perpetual means, right, until we all perhaps come together and decide to undo it. But it can't just be one party that decides to undo it. That's what I said. I said, no government has ever instituted in the history of the world that had as its end object to be dissolved. They all intended to be perpetual. Anyway, I can say a little more of this. I should say this also. Although I did say that the Constitution doesn't address secession directly, I will object to you point out that the Supreme Court had never made a ruling on this. But I did say the issue of secession has been already discussed in this nation. I said this in my first inaugural address.
I'm going to read it.
And I said, you should. And I wish that all the Southerners had read it back in the day. Could have avoided a civil war. But anyway, I said this. I said, the question of secession has been discussed and has been answered back in 1832-33. When the state of South Carolina said they're not going to obey these federal laws on the tariff. And our president, namesake of your city, Andrew Jackson, a Southerner, was the one who put down nullification in favor of you. So I said in my first inaugural address that the question of secession has been discussed and answered back in the days of President Jackson. Thank you, Jackson. Andy Jackson was Jefferson. Later Republican. We're on opposite sides of things, but on some things we do agree. And Andy Jackson, by the way, you know, he was the one who appointed me postmaster in New Salem, Illinois. You might wonder why a Democrat would appoint a Whig. And those go to your friends, don't they? Well, maybe you don't do that. Anyway, the answer is this. I'm honest, and I know how to read and write. I kind of fit the bill. And when I was president, I left the portrait of Andy Jackson hanging over the mantelpiece in my office, kept it there all 4 years. Thank you.
Do you have a question for me, Mr. Lincoln?
Well, I did the last question, so it's your turn to ask the question. Then we both need to answer.
Okay, well.
Unless you don't want to answer.
Oh, yeah. I can answer the same question, but people wonder maybe, were you an abolitionist? Because of what how many remember what I said? They wanted slavery done away with what? Now, 4 million people free at once. They'd all have a job on Monday. But anyway, that's more enough of my rhetoric. Mr. Lincoln, you go ahead and
Very fair question. The truth is that my views evolve over time. And I'm back in my days in Illinois in the state legislature. I would know abolitionists. In fact, we kind of wondered about the abolitionists out in Illinois. You see, we weren't quite sure what they were getting at. They seemed to just make things more difficult, kind of create more tension. In fact, you know, when the state of New York and the state of Connecticut both would benefited from slavery, you know, the North did benefit from slavery economically. We need to acknowledge it. And 3 southern states, and New York and Connecticut, asked all the other states in the North to pass resolutions against abolition societies. The Illinois state legislature complied, saying that we are against the doctrines promulgated by these abolition societies. Now, I objected a little bit to the whole issue. I in particular wanted to make sure that the people of the District of Columbia could free their slaves if they wished to. But this was overruled, and so later I filed sort of an objection. And I also wanted to point out, I wanted to give an equal condemnation. If we're going to condemn abolitionists for raising up trouble, we need to condemn the slave owners too for raising up trouble. Because I said slavery is based on both bad policy and injustice. My whole life long I felt that slavery was wrong, a moral wrong. The question is, how do we deal it with politically? And that's where it kind of moves. Now later, of course, come the 1850s and the lead up to the Civil War. And when I became president, when I was running for president, you might remember I was very clear. I said, if you elect me to be your president, I shall do nothing to interfere with the institution of slavery in those states where it already exists. I said, I feel I have no power to do anything about slavery there. The Constitution protects slavery. I, as president, have to obey the Constitution, just like everybody else. Now, that doesn't mean I'm still not against slavery on a moral level, that I desire that slavery will disappear, but politically, in my capacity as president, what can I do? What can I not? So at the beginning of the war, that's why there's only one objective. The objective is to preserve the Union. It is not to abolish slavery. And I made that very clear in my speech. The speech that I wish the Southerners had read. Now what happened? A year into the Civil War, it's pretty clear. The fact that there are slaves in the South is helping the South in their rebellion. So I said, I think I do have authority to do something about slavery now. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. That's when I came up with that Emancipation Proclamation. Where we would say that the slaves in the South would be free. No. The slaves in the rebellious states would be free. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the border states. Those states which are still loyal to the Union, those slave states still loyal to the Union. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware. I had no authority under the Constitution to do anything about slavery there. But we could work with those states to encourage them to abolish slavery on their own, something that Maryland would do in November 1864, and Missouri would do in January 1865. But once my Emancipation Proclamation took effect, it meant the purpose of the war is now twofold. It's to preserve the Union, and it's eventually to work toward the abolition of slavery. Still got to kind of work through the details of how that's going to come about, how long it will take, etc. But by that point in time, we had two objectives. Preserve the Union and abolish slavery or set up a process by which slavery will be abolished at some point not too far in the future. I guess I've said enough about that.
You want me to come up and talk about abolition?
Well, you want to talk about something else?
I'm going to talk about that.
Maybe I should point out also that Frederick Douglass came to visit me August 10th, 1853. And he complained to me a bit about... 53, I'm sorry, 63.
Oh, I was going to say
1863. 1863. He came to the White House to see me. And he was mostly concerned about the fact that, well, we had done something good. We had followed the black leaders' advice to allow the black men to serve in our army and navy. But they weren't getting paid the same as the white soldiers. You see, at the beginning, we thought that the black soldiers were just to be used for support duties, not in combat, which meant that a black private was getting $10 per month, a white private getting $13 a month. Frederick Douglass said, I'm not recruiting any more troops, so I go to Lincoln and talk about this. And he came to see me. I said, I agree with you. But we got to get Congress to change it. It took Congress a while. Can't imagine that, can you? Congress taking a while to get something done, what they should do. But eventually they did. They made it retroactive here. So now the black and white soldiers getting the same pay. By the way, the Navy was always the same. The sailors got the same pay. But in any event, that's the way I'm going.
Well, you're going to go sit down.
I'll go sit down.
Abolition. When I started thinking about abolitionists, they really had no clue to what was going on. Did I say slavery was good? No. Did I say I wanted to be a slave? No. We have 4 million enslaved people in 15 slave states in the South. As you heard him say, 4 of those states stayed within the Union. There was 15, so we have 11 states. Now, the thing about abolition is, most people, and I'm including some of you sitting here, sometimes have this kind of thought process. Everyone seemed to think, now let's take that back. A number of people thought that all slave owners beat their slaves. Correct? No, they did not. Now, you want to come up here, young lady? Yeah, you. How about you, young man? I'm going to go to the slave auction in 1855, and I need a new carpenter. Now, right now, I'm telling you, this man has a skill. The starting bid on, how many heard me say the starting bid? Might be $1,200 for one individual. You want him, I want him. You think we're going to pay $1,200? No. Why is he, now what could you do with $1,200 in 1855? You could buy a house and property and furnish it. Now, thinking wisely, would I go out and mistreat this man, not feed him, beat him and everything else, so he wouldn't do any work for me? No, not every single slave owner was a Simon Legree that was in a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Nobody's ever heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin? Written by your favorite lady, Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose father was a preacher, whose brothers were preachers, and what did she want to be? Women don't preach. Did the Bible say that? So her little book that come out, people started reading it, and if it's written down, now there's people that I know that are like this, especially under the age of 12. If it's written down, it's got to be true. That means everyone. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who I was named after, by the way. You come up here, young man. He said this about slavery. It's like grabbing a wolf by the ears. If you hang on, you got a problem. If you let go, you got a problem. Okay, now do you start to understand that a gradual emancipation probably was going to happen if the war didn't happen itself? You understand that? So I'm going back to the causes, and I'm going to bring up two groups that were extreme groups. Everybody in the middle gets kind of pushed and shoved. You have to think like the extremes. Fire eaters, withdraw from the Union now. We don't need the North. Yes, we do! Where do you think our cotton got milled? You ever heard of Lowell, Massachusetts? You understand where I'm coming from? We needed the North. And I, myself, was a reluctant, unwilling, those of you who don't know what reluctant means, secessionist. But when my state seceded, what did I do? Seceded, I said, to hell with the Union, and I went home. And then I get a telegram, and Verena sees me reading the telegram, and it looked like somebody died. She said, oh, I wonder if something happened to Joseph, my old brother. I read it, and they said, we elected you provisional president by the provisional Congress. It started out as 7 lower South states, followed by Arkansas, Virginia, Tennessee, and barely North Carolina. You might say, what do you mean barely? Well, they had to vote. What's the majority of 10? 6. It means 4 people's unhappy. How many understand where I'm coming from? When you got opinions that are extreme, majority rule doesn't work. It never did work. That's why we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. I didn't mean to shout. Am I hurting your ears? Okay, I just wondered if somebody started covering their ears. I did. The thing of it is, it's very, very complicated. And Mr. Link would be the first to tell you that it was not just black and white. This side thinks this side thinks that. How many probably don't even realize that there were people in the South that were loyal to the Union? So here comes the Union cavalry, and they said, we need to burn this house down. You come running out and said, well, I'm loyal to the North. I'm loyal to the Union. You think they listened to them? No. They labeled them. Oh, you're from the South, you think like this. People don't like to be clumped into groups, do they? They don't. Because we're all individuals. Mr. Lincoln, should I ask you a question now?
You could even ask the audience.
Well, yeah. I didn't even want time to do it.
3:20.
Oh, I got 3:20. It's been 3:25 the last 3 hours.
Doesn't look like they're going anywhere. I did want to point out, lest you get the wrong idea about Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Go ahead.
I did say to Harriet Beecher Stowe when we met, so you're the little lady that brought on this great war. Uncle Tom's Cabin presented various scenarios under which slavery existed in the South. From the very worst, slaves who were beaten, to the very best, if we can call it best, of slaves who were treated well. So it covers the whole gamut. So somebody reading that book wouldn't come to the conclusion that all slave owners in the South beat their slaves, if they read the book.
Just like your first inaugural.
Just like my first and all. Gotta read. Should we ask them that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a number of people that's going to ask questions. So I'm going to go from here to there.
The lady back there had a question, it looks like, and she's from Jackson.
President Lincoln, if you agreed with President Davis's assessment that slavery probably would have phased out on its own.
Well, that was an interesting point, and I've been thinking about it ever since you said it. And I really don't know, but I have an inkling that maybe not. Because if you look at what had happened from 1776 to 1860, it was just the opposite. Slavery during those years became more important to the economy of the South and more entrenched in the society. You know that when they were debating the Constitution, even before that, the Articles of Confederation, there were Southerners who were abolitionists making the point that they all felt slavery was wrong, but it was a necessary evil, right? They had this idea that sometimes slavery will disappear, as you said. But those were the people from the late 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, we know, was a slave owner. The man who penned our Declaration of Independence was a slave owner. Yet he also said this, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." George Mason, another Virginia slave owner, he gave a violent abolition speech. He was arguing for the abolition of slavery back in the 1780s.
And he was a slave owner.
He was a slave owner. But you know what? 2 generations later, his grandson, James Murray Mason, was senator from Virginia, and he said something to the effect of this: "I believe a great change has been effected in the South. That now we all recognize that slavery is a good condition for both the slave and the master." They were no longer proffering excuses for slavery. They had become apologists for slavery, saying slavery is a good. Slavery is the natural condition of an inferior race. Slavery is God's will and plan for humanity. The mind of the South, and many of the gentlemen, planters in particular, had undergone a startling radicalization in the years from 1780 to 1860. So I believe that instead of slavery kind of disappearing, probably we're very possibly, I should say, could have just become just even stronger in the South. It would have taken some outside force. And what that outside force might have been, pressure from the rest of the world perhaps, I think eventually slavery would have been abolished in the South. But how it would come about, how long it would take, I guess that's, we really can't answer.
Well, I really believe that England and France did not side with us because Victoria did not agree with the slavery issue. Now, there are some of us that have said, free all the slaves and start the war. I mean, secede. Now, I don't think you people understand how much money a slave owner had in these people. You have your property, you have your home, you have your furniture, you have your livestock, you have your crops. Where did the majority of your money get tied up? You already heard me say that I might pay $1,500 to $2,000 for one individual. If I had 120, how many think I had a lot of money invested? But then when you got a Congress, and some of those people don't have enough sense to get out of the ring, I've served with a number of them, they're idealistic. You know what it means to be idealistic? On paper it looks good. In reality it doesn't. See, these questions keep asking and keep answering to yourself and saying it's not just these Union soldiers went to fight to free these slaves. They did not. It didn't say on any of the posters, did it? Come join the Union or Union Army to free slaves? Say that? Did it say on the Southern recruiting posters, come maintain slavery? No, it did not. See, people confuse those arguments. What caused the war? Why men fight? They're not the same. At all. Those of you who know how to argue, the key to winning an argument is being a great listener. And I've listened to Mr. Lincoln like he's listened to me. And I've learned a lot from him. You might have learned a little bit from me. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions.
Or which one of us?
Both of them.
Okay.
Mr.
I'll let him go first then.
Well, I think it's President.
Mr. Davis.
Oh, okay.
President Davis. How many presidents were slave owners?
Okay, that's real easy. George Washington, elected for 2 terms, was a slave owner. Before he died, he said, I want to free my slaves. He couldn't free Martha's. You understand? You might say, what do you mean he couldn't free Martha's? She was a Custis. Those slaves belonged to the Custis family. Her grandchildren, because her children died. George Washington Park Custis built a home called the Custis Mansion. He had a daughter named Mary. Mary married Robert E. Lee in 1831. See, it gets complicated, doesn't it?
It's going to be a long answer to a short question.
But to answer your question, I don't know if I can really give you a simple answer that you would say, I like that answer. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
I know the answer.
Go ahead.
13.
Well, no, I started. I forgot what I was talking about. Okay. Washington was a slave owner, and I got caught up in Washington because I revered him so much, just like he, loved him so much too. Adams did not. The second president. Third president, Thomas Jefferson did. James Madison for 2 terms did. James Monroe for 2 terms did. John Quincy Adams, what do you think? No. 7th President Andrew Jackson, yes. Martin Van Buren from New York, no. 9th William Henry Harrison, yes. 10th John Tyler, yes. 11th James Knox Polk, most definitely for 1 term. You know, he died a month after he served office. Wow. Worked himself to death. Number 12, Zachary Taylor, my former father-in-law, yes. Millard Fillmore, no. Franklin Pierce, who was my president when I served as Secretary of War, no. James Buchanan, no. Abraham Lincoln's family.
Mary's family.
Well, I just said Abraham Lincoln's family. Didn't say anything about Mary. But a number of Mary's brothers fought for the Confederacy. How many said, I never knew that? The Todds, don't get me started on the, you probably want to comment on that.
Well, I just wanted to point out, in case there's a mistaken impression, the Lincoln family did not own slaves. My father, my mother did not own slaves. My grandparents were Quakers. They didn't own slaves. We belonged, growing up in Kentucky, a slave state, to the Little Pigeon, Little Mount Separate Baptist Church. You know why we were separate? We split off a church over the issue of slavery. We were anti-slavery. The Lincoln family never owned slaves. Did I marry into a slave-holding family? I did. Miss Mary Todd never owned slaves. Why would her father bequeath his 3 slaves to a Mary who's married to me instead of some of the Confederate brothers? So just to clarify, the Todd family, yes, slave owners. The Lincoln family, no.
My last question. Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, Richmond, you know about Richmond.
Well, both of them should know. When the Confederate Army vacated Richmond,
Yes,
and you came to town,
I came to town.
did you actually sit in Mr. Davis's chair?
I did. I don't know if he knows this or not.
Can I add something first before you answer, Mr. Lincoln? I was sitting in church, April 2nd, it was Sunday, and a courier from Robert E. Lee sent it, and I read it, and I wanted to hear the rest of the sermon. Did you hear what I just said? I wanted to hear the rest of the sermon, and he had to come to class. Lee said that we cannot hold Petersburg anymore. You better evacuate Richmond. We left that Sunday. The following Sunday, April 9th, Appomattox happened. Lee surrendered to Grant. Now, your visitation to Richmond was,
I believe it's 4.
the 4th, which is 2 days
Monday,
after.
the 3rd, or Tuesday.
Right, well, but 2 days, well, I didn't see over there.
I think I know.
Yeah, you know. Did you realize how dangerous that was for him? Really seriously, how dangerous that was for him to go to Richmond? And you tell your story.
Well, I had been down at City Point, down in Virginia with my Union troops for the previous week or so, 10 days ago. I've been down there, following movements, because it looks pretty clear. Grant's closing in on Lee. It's almost over now. We had the siege on Petersburg. We thought Petersburg would fall, Lee's army would be captured. Lee somehow got out. But the day, he was counting down the days at that point. And I was torn. I need to get back to Washington, take care of some business, but I really want to see the end of it. And finally, April 2nd, Richmond is evacuated. Well, the government left Richmond. The soldiers left Richmond. Some of the white people left Richmond. The slaves stayed behind. And so when I walked into Richmond on the following Tuesday, it was an eerie sight. The Confederate soldiers had set fires because they didn't want the material to fall into our hands. So the whole place was burning. They put out the fires. And it's an eerie place, hardly anyone there. We could see behind the windows, you could see white faces looking out at us. I didn't see any rifles, but there probably was one somewhere around there. And we saw a lot of the black slaves there. And they were rejoicing, coming up to me. I did walk all the way down to what you call the Confederate White House. And I walked in there.
Clay Street.
And it was actually your servant or slave, whatever you might call it.
He was on the second floor.
He showed me, he said, Mr. Lincoln, I'd like to show you Mr. Davis's office. I said, I sure like to see it. And I walked into your office and I sat down in your chair. Beg pardon, you shouldn't have done that, but it gave me a great measure of satisfaction. I said, I think now we're near the end. We're near the end. Another question. Question over here at this end, or?
Would Mr. Lincoln be willing to recite the Gettysburg Address for us?
I can do that, but I would hold that for later.
That'd take about 2 minutes.
Let's do some questions first. I know there's a hand in the back.
My opinion is that you were an abolitionist, but a practical one. Not a Henry David Thoreau abolitionist, but that you were definitely an abolitionist from reading all your papers.
I'd say by the end, very, very end of my life, you might call me an abolitionist, but maybe you still need to qualify somehow.
Well,
At
then
that
you're a
point,
practical abolitionist.
Right. We're going to think it about now. Earlier in my presidency, I thought gradual emancipation. Because if we set free 4 million people, 4 million people who have never known what it is to be free, never worked for themselves, how will they survive? They may all be dead in a year. So we need to do it gradually, but we need to do it. But as time went on, as the situation changed, I'd say I became more of an abolitionist. We're going to just have to say they're free and figure it out somehow. But still, it's a very complicated situation. You know, one question we need to make is the cause of the war. We need to get that one at some point.
So how did you feel about one of Frederick Douglass's good friend, John Brown?
Oh, John Brown. I don't know what you felt about him. Could you answer it in just 1 minute?
Yes.
And I'll do 1 minute. As we go on and
John Brown was an insurrectionist. He was idealist. You realize in Kansas, we better not get into popular science, because they'll be here till midnight. The problem with John Brown is he was an insurrectionist. He went to Kansas and they bled because it was going to go by majority rule whether Kansas was going to be free or slave state. Two popular sovereignty, which we didn't even talk about. So what happened with that is he went out there and caused all kinds of people got killed. Now, one of the persons that put up $25,000 when they put $100,000 on my head, his name was Garrett Smith. He was wealthy. He was an abolitionist. By the way, 3 abolitionists paid for that $75,000. You hear me? But Garrett Smith probably financed the John Brown's raid. And they wanted to see trouble. Okay? So, that's a big one, Wayne.
And I'll just say that I was in Kansas when John Brown was hanged. And I was asked what I thought of John Brown.
He wasn't hanged in Virginia. He was hanged in Virginia.
Right. I was in Kansas, and word got to Kansas that John Brown had been hanged out in Virginia. So I got word, and they asked me, "What do you think of John Brown?" And I said, "Well, I admire the man for his courage, for his belief that slavery is an evil, and we need to put an end to slavery. But I disagree with him on his methods. He was a traitor and attacking the federal government, and the methods, I said, were wrong. But I believe in the man's goal, his objective, right? By the way, have you ever heard of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great Italian general? You know, he offered to command the Union troops at the beginning of the war.
He would have been better than McClellan.
He would have been. Yeah. But he said only if you declare the emancipation of the slave. Something we weren't ready to do at the beginning. So I had to turn him down. Later, when I issued my Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote me a letter. He said, "Posterity will call you the great emancipator." He said, "You have done a noble work in freeing the slave." He said, "People, you have followed the work of Jesus Christ and John Brown." All right, one question. Well, we need to, let's do somebody else. Somebody else had a question yet.
Over here, the black cat.
Yes, Mr. President Lincoln and President Jefferson, you both had tragedies, and not only was the nation divided, but you lost a son, during
You're gonna make me cry, aren't you?
it's Sunday. How did you both handle that tragedy? Not only trying to keep the nation from tearing itself apart, but you had personal tragedies of losing little sons during that war.
I'll go. We had 5-year-old Joseph, who was probably very precocious and probably was going to be one of those who was very ambitious and bright. The brother born before him, Jefferson Jr., I'll just be honest, was lazy. He was. Later on, he couldn't even handle being at the military academy in Virginia. But anyway, Joseph was a 5-year-old, went out on the veranda on April 30th of 1864. My friend Verena with his child, we were going to have her final child, our 6th child, Verena Hanborn, June 27th of, so 2 months later, she was 7 months of a child, and he fell off the veranda. Now, I worked at the customs house, Mr. Lincoln. I didn't work in my own office. And Verena was having lunch with me, and we rushed back, and to see her little boy was crushed skull.
I suppose you know that back in Springfield, we had lost Eddie, our second son, tuberculosis. Age not quite 4 years old. Terrible loss. So when we went to Washington, we just got the 3 boys left. Actually, Robert didn't come with us. He's off at Harvard College. Imagine that. I only had a year of school my whole life. Before Robert went to Harvard College. What a country. Well, Willie, he was 10 years old. Tad was almost 8. Had that first year in the White House. Wonderful year. Almost. Because the boys took sick. Tad and Willie. Typhoid fever. You know where we got the drinking water from the White House? Piped in directly from the Potomac River. Who else is in Washington at the time? Tens of thousands of Union troops doing their business. Tad recovered. Willie did not. I remember going into my secretary, John Hay, I said, he's gone. He's actually gone. I can understand. Some things we can understand. The loss of a child, loss of others. You know, the very first officer killed in the Civil War was my personal friend Elmer Ellsworth.
In Virginia.
Edward Baker, Senator Edward Baker, namesake of my boy Eddie, who died back in Springfield, was killed at Falls Bluff. Only U.S. Senator ever killed in the Civil War. A personal friend. I wrote out hundreds of condolence letters to grieving parents, including the parents of Elmer Ellsworth, during the war. I hope you all agree with that too. Another question.
I will say this, Mr. Lincoln, that when we lost Eddie, I finally said to myself, because I never wanted the war. But see, a number of those people I kept calling fire eaters in Congress, or do nothing in Congress, but Congress thought there wouldn't be a war. We'd secede and nothing would happen. He'd be over the country, nothing. But the thing is, we were different than Washington started his administration. We started with a war. Where do you think we got our money for the treasury? That's another 15 minutes of a talk. See, it's like I said, everything we're talking about is complicated. It's not just black and white like some people want to think of. And I know that losing Willie, he must have been very precocious too.
They say Willie was the one most like me.
And I say Joseph was the one most like me. And we lose him at a young 5, and I don't know how old was Willie. 11 years old. By the way, what time is it? What?
I do think, to answer relatively quickly the question of what was the cause of the Civil War, but I believe it's still argued today for some reason. You want to go first? Yeah, get a drink.
You know, the people don't have anything left in here. There are people I know that will say slavery had absolutely nothing to do with the war that caused. There are people I know that say slavery was the only cause of the war. Which one's right? Neither. If a marriage dissolves, do you think there's just one reason? No. Slavery constantly, when we talked about compromising, Mr. Lincoln, we talked about the 3/5 compromise. We never talked about the Great Compromise. That makes it, I don't know what the Great Compromise was. You got a little state and a big state. Virginia says, we want our representation by a population. We want, a little Delaware says, or whatever, Rhode Island, or whoever it was, said, well, it could have been Rhode Island, because they were, anyway, they say we want everyone to have 2. So what happens if we create a bicameral legislature? The House of Representatives by population, the Senate having 2 representatives. So I believe 2 extreme groups pushed it quicker than it should have happened, is the abolitionists and the fire eaters. I may say, wait a minute, these two extremes. Now, you know, really, in a sense, when we fired upon Fort Sumter, we're firing against the American flag. What do you think is going to have to be the reaction? Okay, goodbye. Lincoln calls up 75,000.
3 months, he said. 3 months is enough. They wouldn't on
Yeah, they kind of take 3 months home. Put it down. There's another reaction. What happens? By you calling 75,000, 4 more states seceded. It went from 7 to 11, including Virginia. And of course, Virginia, Jamestown, the only state in the Union. Where do you think we had to move the Confederacy to, the capital of the Confederacy to? But the thing of it is, there's a reason they did that. We knew the war was going to be fought mostly in Virginia. Virginia claims to have more battles there than any other state. How many miles are between Richmond and the District of Columbia? Less than 100. By the way, we were both born in Kentucky, less than 100 miles away from each other. I'm 8 months older than this guy. One ran north, one ran south. Go ahead, Mr. Lincoln.
I just wanted to, it's obviously a large question, what caused the Civil War. I just wanted to make the point that for those who say states' rights was the cause of the war, and that was said, the lost cause, all that. I just wanted to point out a few things. First of all, in my second inaugural address, I said slavery, I said all knew somehow that slavery was the cause of this war. And if we go back to the beginning, you know, every state when they seceded, they issued a declaration of secession. They all talked about slavery. Mississippi said, called slavery the greatest material interest of the world. Yeah. Now, I should point out to you, you might want to look this up. Alexander Stevens, your vice president, my good friend from Georgia.
Talk about the Cornerstone.
Yeah, look it up for you, Cornerstone speech, where he acknowledged that slavery was the cause of the rupture. The war hadn't started, the cause of the rupture. I'll point this out too. Do you know the Confederacy adopted a constitution? What they do, they took the U.S. Constitution, they copied it over, made some changes.
We didn't have a Supreme Court.
In the preamble, it makes no mention of a more perfect union. It talks about the free and independent states of the South. But that's the preamble. That really doesn't say much. You go compare it later to the various provisions. Some areas they gave more rights to the states, some they took some away. The main difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution is this. The U.S. Constitution does not mention slavery or slave by name. It used coded language, right? Persons held in service to labor, etc. Because the people were thinking, someday we won't have slavery, we don't want any reminder that we had slavery. The Confederate Constitution says, no law shall be passed impairing or denying the right to property in Negro slaves. They even specify the color of the slave. That's the main difference between the Confederate Constitution and the U.S. Constitution.
Well, you had we had a line item veto with the president, and we also had a presidential term, one 6 years. I want to make one more comment before we close. Alexander Stevens said this, and we parted company pretty quick after he left and went back to Georgia. He said the writers of the Declaration of Independence had it all wrong. The Negroes were not equal with the white man. Now, I do not want you to leave thinking that the northern people were all white lily that loved all of the Negroes in the South. No. That didn't happen. And it wasn't even true. Even Lincoln's cabinet would probably argue about that issue. Even Lincoln himself, if you read his 1858 debates with Douglas, what he said. But see, opinions change. My opinions of women when I was 16 was a lot different than they were when I got married, and then when we had a baby girl, my opinion changed again. That's called maturity. You'll never quote me what I said when I was 12. Understand? So I hope that every one of you enjoyed your time with us. And by the way,
I did want to point out,
Go ahead.
I hadn't quite finished my answer on states' rights because I think this might be the most important argument of all. When I hear that states' rights was the cause of the Civil War, my follow-up question is, which state rights are you concerned with? And we all know, the right to own slaves. You know, in 1850, we mentioned the Compromise of 1850, which in addition to admitting California as a free state, also greatly strengthened the fugitive slave law. It said that federal authorities should cooperate with slave owners going to north to retrieve their slaves. The federal authorities will cooperate with that. Now, who didn't like that? People in the north. They hated the fugitive slave. And they started passing laws in the north, states and cities, saying when those federal authorities come up with those slave owners to retrieve their fugitive slaves, the local and state authorities don't need to cooperate with them. Think about that for a moment. Local and state authorities don't need to cooperate with federal officials enforcing federal law. You might call them sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. Now, Southerners objected to these new laws. They say you can't have a state law which trumps, pardon me, you can't have a state law which trumps federal law. In 1850, who's arguing for states' rights? The North. Who's arguing for federal supremacy? The South. Which is why I say when somebody tells you the Civil War was caused by states' rights, you ask them, which state?
and you notice I never mentioned that. I may say I never said that. Because this subject matter that we've discussed is about as complicated as women.
No, not that complicated.
Don't tell me you don't agree with that, Mr. Lincoln.
Well, they're both very complicated.
Well, you go ahead and explain the 87 years and all that, because people get, you know, that speech of his, I never could write like him. I never could write like him, because when he spoke to people like they were 11 years old. And that's what I didn't say. You hear what I just said? Do you understand where I was coming from, Mr. Lincoln? He said I lost the debate just because I said that.
I was asked to give the Gettysburg Address. I'll be very happy to do that. When I'm done with that, we'll both be around a few more minutes. We'll be happy to answer more questions. We'll be happy to pose for you. We got Mrs. Davis here. I'm sorry Mrs. Lincoln's not here. She said something about doing some shopping. This is my address at Gettysburg, November 19, 1863, about 4.5 months after the great battle had ended. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot consecrate, we cannot dedicate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did. It is rather for us to live to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored days we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. I need to back up. I actually got off track there just for a moment. I want to get this right. I'm sorry, Jesus. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored days we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Liked it, because back in the day it was kind of divided.
You could have just said in 1776.
News media back in our day, by the way, was very partisan. Don't know if you know that. I'm sure it's much more structured than biased.
Well, hope you enjoyed our...